welcome to Christian Answers. My name is Jeff Short, and today we're going to be talking about a debate that took place in Utah between Dr. James White, Christian apologist, and Jeff Durbin, both on the same team. Jeff Durbin, pastor of Apologia Church. These two debated two atheists in Utah, and I wanted to just give my commentary and opinions on this debate. The topic was, does the triune God exist? And so both sides came together to talk about this topic. Now, what happened was that Jeff Durbin and Dr. James White decided right off the bat that they would challenge the atheist worldview directly. So while they did talk about the triune God, they did talk about the Trinity, they talked about the Christian understanding of God, they were more or less attacking the whole idea of atheism as a system, as a structure, as a way of thinking. And the atheists in turn responded by saying, hey, this is supposed to be a debate about the Trinity, and now you're changing it to actually talk more about the whole idea of the atheistic worldview. Well, now, is that legitimate? Was that legitimate for Jeff Durbin and James White to essentially change the debate topic and get more narrow and specific and talk more in terms of the faults and fallacies of the atheistic worldview? Well, they did that anyway, whether it was perfectly legit or not, they did, and it could have been a good conversation because the atheist could have then gone into an explanation of why and how they can function under their atheistic worldview, and they could have gone along with that. They did not, unfortunately. They were ready to come at the Christians, James White and Jeff Durbin. The atheists were ready to come at them with insults and invectives and just slander and all kinds of put downs and just trash talk Christianity. That's what they wanted to do with the debate. And Jeff Durbin and James White didn't let them do that because they put the atheists on defense. Now, what was it that James White and Jeff Durbin were doing by putting the atheists on defense? What they were doing, their argument was that under the atheistic worldview, there is no philosophical basis for logic, the rules of logic. There's no basis for ethics, ethical thinking, morality, distinguishing between right and wrong, ultimate meaning and purpose in life. In other words, Jeff Durbin, when he started out his talks, he spoke first, directly attacked the atheist's way of thinking. So the atheist is automatically put on defensive. And what the atheists could have done, and what would have been really interesting for this debate, is try to engage the Christians in a defense of their own worldview, in the defense of atheism. But they didn't do that. They said, nope, we're not going to do this. We refuse to go here. We're just going to talk about the Christian understanding of God and how we're going to chop it up and try to cut it down. They weren't willing to engage in an honest dialogue about their own philosophical foundations. And that was the problem. That was the shame. Because the atheist, even though they were surprised that Jeff Durbin and James White did not start out with quoting scripture, quoting Christian sources to try to understand and explain the Trinity. They did do a little of that, but the bulk of their argument was against the atheist thinking process. So let me try to summarize what and this is called presuppositional apologetics, or the transcendent or transcendental argument for the existence of God. It's something that a lot of people have never really thought through. They really don't know much about what this is, but what it basically boils down to is arguing that only the existence of an infinite personal God, the very God that Christianity teaches, the Judeo-Christian understanding of God, the Old Testament, New Testament understanding of God, only that God provides an adequate philosophical foundation for even attempting to come at topics such as morality, what is right, what is wrong. Only the Judeo-Christian God and presupposing him will allow you to even respect the result of rational thought. Now, let me talk a little bit about that, because this is what Jeff Durbin talked a little bit about, and this is what you will get when you are talking to anyone who is arguing from a presuppositional apologetic approach or a transcendental argument for God. What the argument boils down to is you need the God of Christianity. You need the Judeo-Christian God, the infinite personal God, to even have any integrity in any kind of an argument. For any rational thought, for any moral thinking, you need the Judeo-Christian God, the God concept of the Jews and the Christians, to even make sense of anything you're talking about, because without that philosophical foundation, you're left with just animals babbling. Now, let me explain what that means. In order to have rational thought, in order to have any kind of an argument, you have to assume that our mind, our thinking, is able to correspond with reality. You have to be able to assume that. You have to also assume that there are things called laws of logic, that there is a law of non-contradiction. You have to assume that basic syllogisms, things that the Greeks, like the Aristotle and some of the early Greeks, developed ways of thinking. If A, then B, A, then B. You have to assume logic. Now, who can legitimately assume that there is a correspondence between rational thought and the real world? Well, the Christian, the Jew and the Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition. Why? Because you have a infinite personal God. You have a personal, rational God behind everything. So then, if you have a personal, rational God behind everything, then you can assume that your thinking corresponds with reality, because you have a God who made the universe, and he made it intelligent, and he created things, intelligently designed things, and so you can assume that there is a correspondence there. But if you're an atheist, and if you believe that everyone is simply the product of an uncaring, impersonal, natural process that didn't have anything in mind from the beginning and doesn't have anything in mind for the future, and we're just a product of random chance, in the sense of natural selection, random mutations. If we're survival of the fittest, natural selection, we have no guarantee that our reasoning ability is actually getting at anything called truth, because after all, it might just be our reasoning process is good for survival. The goal of evolution, the atheists believe, is survival of the fittest, and those creatures that are best fitted for the future are the ones that survive, and the ones that are least fitted, they die off. So truth is not really a part of the mixture of the survival of the fittest scheme. Natural selection does not have anything to do with truth in the sense of something is real or not real. It only has survival value. So how do we know that our minds, our reasoning, our language, our words are actually capable of arriving at truth rather than just capable of arriving at survival value. Because there is a difference between something that has practical value and something that is true. You can make a kid happy by telling them a lie, and that lie then has benefit for the kid because they're happy and it makes them feel good. But it's not the truth. And it's the same way with our thinking process and our rational thought. There might be survival value in actually participating in some activity that helps you survive, but it's actually not true, but it's survival valuable. So the atheist has no guarantee that what he is thinking or that the product of his rational argument is actually getting at what is really true, what is reality. It could be all just a survival mechanism. Reasoning could be a survival mechanism. And so we can't really trust the product of rational thought. And so the atheist has a real problem. The atheist has a problem of what is called epistemology. He doesn't have anything to actually claim that anything is true. But the Christian does, because God is beyond and above everything, and God is a rational being. God is the ultimate mind. He's an intelligent designer. And when we go out and we look at nature, we are actually discovering what God has created, and we're discovering what God has produced through his rational mind. In the early chapters of Genesis, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and earth. And then later on it says, and he said that is good. And he said, let there be light. And there was light. So God is doing intelligent creation. He is speaking forth the word. Words come from an intelligent mind. And so we know that the universe out there is orderly. There are laws and regular occurrences of things because there is a mind behind it all, and we can assume rationally that our minds, because we're made in the image of God, it says in the Bible that we are something like God, only on a small scale. We are made in his image, so we have the capacity to reason and think and speak, and we have a moral capacity. And because of that correspondence between our image of God and God himself, we have a rational basis for believing that there is something to be gained by reasoning and making arguments and using our minds. And there is truth out there, and that we can seek truth because there is a foundation behind everything of truth, because God is truth, and there is something behind everything. It's not just a chaotic, blooming mess in the universe. The universe has order. The universe has created design. And we live in a universe of created design, and we serve a God who is a rational God. So there's a context for reason. There's a context for believing that we can get at the truth, and that we should sharpen our thinking, and we should sharpen our arguments to arrive at truth. So the Christian, the Jew and the Christian understanding, the Bible view of God provides an epistemology that allows us to believe that the result of our arguments produces something closer to the truth. But the atheist has to simply assume that there is some kind of a correspondence between their mind and the real world. They have no rational basis for believing that. They just have to assume it. And in many ways, like Jeff Durbin was saying during this debate, the atheist actually has to borrow the assumptions of the Judeo-Christian tradition, incorporate that into their argument, and then try to use it against the Christian. For example, this really shows up when you're talking about ethics and morality. The moral basis of society or even personal morality is a big problem for the atheists because they have no foundation for morality. And the reason they have no foundation for morality is how do you get a right and a wrong in an impersonal process of evolution, survival of the fittest? There is no value judgment in nature according to evolution and the atheists except survivability. So if something helps you survive the next generation and perpetuates your genes, then that's a good thing as far as evolution is concerned. But that survivability advantage is the only thing that matters in evolution. There is no, quote, right or wrong behavior. There is no good or bad behavior. There's only, does this help me survive? Does this hinder me from surviving? That is the only test in the evolutionary scheme. So atheists who believe in evolution, they have to believe in evolution because it's the only explanation they have that encompasses everything. They have to believe that there ultimately is no basis or foundation for ethics. And so that's where they have to borrow, which Jeff Durbin tried to bring out and James White tried to bring out, the two Christians tried to bring out, to the atheists. You have to borrow our ethical systems, or you have to borrow parts, bits and pieces of Christian and Jewish morality in order to make your argument against Christianity. For example, when Christopher Hitchens is so outraged about some injustice in the world, some government treating a local population with injustice and violating their rights and so on and so forth, what is the basis in evolution for his outrage? He has no basis in evolution. He has no basis in ethics and morality, his ethics and morality, for being angry or being outraged at an injustice. Because you have to remember, in the evolutionary scheme, survival of the fittest, that's the only thing that counts. That's the only thing that matters under Darwinism. But see, in the Judeo-Christian tradition and the biblical tradition, there is something higher than just mere survivability. What is more important is truth. And what is more important is the basis for that truth, which is found in God. So there is a right and wrong, and that right and wrong, the distinction is found in God and his revelation of himself and what his revelation of right and wrong is. So when you look at, for example, the Ten Commandments, one of the commandments is thou shalt not murder. And we have revelation from God that states a law that says thou shalt not murder. This comes from the mind of God to the mind of man. How do we know that murder is wrong? In the ultimate sense, in the moral, ethical sense, we know because God has said this is wrong. Now, if we were operating under an atheistic perspective, we might just as well believe that murder is right. We might subscribe to the philosophy of might makes right. You know, if I'm bigger than someone and they're in my way, I just murder them and there, problem solved. What would be wrong with just simply the might makes right rule? Well, if you're an atheist, there could be nothing wrong with that rule. The only objection you could say, if you were the weaker person, you would say, well, that's not going to be fun for me, or I don't like that. That's all you can say, or that wouldn't feel good. But that would not be an ethical, moral law. That would just be you're sharing your own personal experience. You're sharing your own personal opinion or preference. And that's what atheism boils down to, because it lacks any kind of metaphysical foundation for right and wrong. There's no ethical foundation for right and wrong in atheism, it has to borrow from Christianity. It has to pretend that there are ultimate categories of good and bad, and then it has to try to quickly slip that by people. It has to try to make these moral judgments, which it has no right to make. It has to make those moral judgments and then hope nobody calls them on it. And that's what these atheists in Utah were trying to do. They were trying to use reason and logic as if it's just a given, and as if we can just assume that we can trust our reason and logic, as if they knew or could somehow know or explain how reason and logic is anything more, is something more than just a survival mechanism. But see, the Christian doesn't have to assume those. He can make a rational case for these things because of the existence of a rational personal God in the background, who provides the context for all other rational minds. We can say we can use reason, we can use logic, because God, ultimately, the greatest mind, He has built into the universe and He's built into our own minds the ability to think. And it makes all sense because of the existence of a rational God. The atheist, on the other hand, believes that the universe came about through random chance, and the universe especially came about through random chance and interacting with laws of nature that just happen to be that way. And we're the product of evolution. We just happen to be this way. We just by chance developed in this direction, and reason itself just happened to develop. And so, it's a survival mechanism at that. So it says nothing about ultimate truth. It doesn't even tell us that our reasoning ability does anything other than help us survive. So we don't know that the arguments that we make under the atheist scheme are anything other than just survival rationales. And maybe our reason, if you're an atheist, maybe your reasoning helps you survive, but it doesn't tell you anything about truth. It doesn't tell you anything about whether what you're talking about corresponds with reality. It just tells you that whatever you're thinking has helped you make it this far, and some other creature might start thinking a certain way and help them surpass us as people on this planet. There's no context. There's no background for anything. It's just all chaotic, materialistic atoms in motion. And so the atheist has to borrow meaning and purpose. They have to borrow ethics and morality. They have to borrow rationality and logic from some kind of a worldview that has a basis for these things. And that's what Jeff Durbin and James White were trying to argue. Now, the atheists were mad because Jeff Durbin and James White did change the topic of the debate somewhat. I wish they had just gone along and said, okay, let's go this direction. Let's talk about the atheistic worldview. Let's see if there's any foundation for it. The atheists didn't want to do that. Why? Because they didn't want to get into that. They hope that Christians let them borrow from the Judeo-Christian biblical tradition, and they hope that Christians don't call them on it. They hope that they can just sort of be given a pass on their inadequate worldview, inadequate foundations for meaning and purpose and ethics and rationality and so on and so forth. They're hoping that the Christians would just say, well, let's just assume that the atheists have these things in their worldview, just to get the argument going so we can get into the more specific topics like the Trinity, like the reliability of the Bible, like Jesus Christ and His atoning work, and so on and so forth. But see, Jeff Durbin and James White were not about to give the atheists any assumptions, and they were demanding that the atheists, before they even get into a topic of Trinity or any other Christian-specific topic, they were asking the atheists, okay, please give us a rational defense of the very foundations of atheism in respect to rationality and morality and meaning and purpose. Tell us why we should believe that anything you say has any correspondence with the real world based on your own worldview. How does your worldview come up with any kind of rational argument for anything? And that was somewhat of a surprise for the atheists, because they were not ready for that being thrown at them. It surprised them, it shocked them, it got them mad, because it's like telling someone, okay, before we start this discussion about the Trinity, tell us why we should believe anything you say. And it sort of takes you back if you're an atheist, because you're saying, well, wait, you're telling me I can't even start talking until I lay a foundation for my own worldview? Now, the Christian can do that. The Christian, if the atheists say, well, why don't you give us a rational foundation for why you should be listened to? Why should anything that you say and any reasoning and arguments you give be brought into the public? Give me a foundation for that. Christian can do that easily, because, like I said before, there's a God who is rational, who's personal, is infinite, all-powerful, all-present. There's a basis in reality for a rational argument given by a Christian. And we can explain that. We can talk about that. We can explain to you the whole context, why we can talk and have dialogue, and why the discussion can be made, because behind our minds is a larger mind. God has revealed truth. There is meaning, there is purpose, there's context for the whole universe. Our lives have meaning. Our faith has meaning. Discussions about topics, important topics, have meaning, and so on and so forth. There's a context, and a Christian can give that. The atheist can't, because if you're just the product of a blind process that didn't have you in mind at the beginning, and doesn't care or know anything about what's going to end up, it's just some survival of the fittest machine that's running, gives you no basis for ethics, gives you no basis for meaning and purpose in life, and gives you no basis, actually no rational basis, for believing that anything you say or the thought process you give has any meaning anyway. So it was an interesting debate. I would encourage you to view it, Jeff Durbin, James White, and these atheists from Utah, and it gets you thinking. I hope that this summary has prompted you to go see that debate. So we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.